More than a few times this week, I turned to Stephanie and said, well, what do you make of that wedding in Cana story? What do you make of it? What does it mean to you? What's the one thing that you can take from it? And the answer is D, all of the above. There are many, many things that we can look at in this story, and perhaps we can all build various and sundry understandings around it. First of all, let's be clear. When did this little story take place in the Gospel of John? You can tell by looking in your service leaflet. Don't put those away, you might need them for later. When was this? When was this done? When did we hear about the wedding in Cana? Well, certainly we have that wonderful opening hymn. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then after that we meet with John the Baptist, don't we? And then after that we have the calling of the disciples, and very soon after that is when we have this wedding in Cana. Just for the sake of argument, do we know where Cana was in those days? You know, in your picture of that part of the world, you know where the Sea of Galilee is? Remember that sort of, in that little image of that part of the world, the Sea of Galilee? If you look at that kind of that little triangular lump off here onto the left, there's Magdala. And if you're going north and you go into the center of Magdala and you take Main Street and turn left, you go out that way for a few miles, several miles, I don't know, 20 miles or so, and there's Cana. Now, let's, while in keeping with this sort of this historical, critical thing that I like to do on Sunday mornings, by the way, when I use a term like that, do we know what I mean when I say historical critical? Do we know what I mean by that? Does anybody want to have a stab at what that means when I use that term? Historical critical?
Questioning whether or not it's real.
Wondering whether or not, or looking at it in an historical context. Trying to determine the realities of the time and making those realities function in the way that we interpret Scripture. So, in the historical sense, we can talk about weddings. We'll talk about this particular wedding, as a matter of fact. Who was getting married in those days? Who was getting married? Okay. Well, were the rich getting married and the poor getting married? There's a clue.
Yes.
There's a clue. There's the understanding that we have of the 20, 30, 40,000, or in some cases $150 or $1 million weddings that take place in the 21st century. Those kinds of weddings were limited in the first century when our incarnate Jesus was walking on the earth. There were arrangements, but we do not have, in the references that I have before me, which are many, but they're not complete. So perhaps there are some references that you will be able to provide for me which describe the nature of weddings themselves these 2,000 years ago. But one aspect of the wedding we can look into John and discover, and that is that it was customary for the good wine to come out first, so that after you have a couple of chalices or cups of the really good wine, and you get a little bit on the tipsy side, and the fun starts and the dancing begins, then the less expensive wine comes out. And so we have a couple of things that happen in this wedding which are very interesting to me. First of all, that they run out of wine. That's not a good thing. That points kind of a ooh, this is a faux pas. This is not a good thing for the bridegroom or the family to run out of wine. My goodness, you must plan better for that. That's number one. Number two, the nature of the wine that comes out is only noticed by the steward, and my guess is that only the persons who drew the water out of those jars recognized how that wine got there. Interesting things. Then we have, of course, this relationship between Jesus and his mother. How often in the Gospel of John do we hear Jesus referring to his mother by her name? Do we have any examples of that? That's your homework assignment. Do we have any examples in the Gospel of John of Jesus referring to his mother as Mom or Mary? That's something that you have before you. But in this instance, he goes, woman, what does that have to do with you? Woman, what does that have to do? And you know, nowadays that sounds so abrupt, doesn't it? That sounds so abrupt, but it's not an unusual way of addressing women in those days. It was not meant to be pejorative. It was not meant to be a slap at his mom necessarily. It was just a reminder that, Mom, you really don't get to tell me when I'm going to be doing my ministry. But I find it very interesting that Mom goes, you know, woman, what does that to do with you? And she goes, just do what he says. Just do what he says. And wasn't it interesting that little part in the scripture where Jesus walks over to those stone jars and sticks his hand in and converts the water to the wine? Isn't that interesting how that happens? No reaction, because that's not what he did. That's very interesting that he doesn't touch it. He just simply tells the servants to to fill them up. Go fill them up. Now, the nature of the jars. Let's talk about the nature of the jars. What kind of jars are they? They are made of what? Stone. Good. They're made of stone. They're stone jars. And what is the nature of a stone jar? Why do you suppose there would be these big 30-gallon stone jars there? It's in your reading. They are designed for the purification rites. The purification rites, not using soap and water, is just the immersion of hand into the water, or pouring that water over the hands, over the feet, or if you have a mikvot, a bath, you would pour these. Chances are good that if you have a household that can afford this kind of a wedding, you're going to have a bath that can be filled with this water, and you go down into it, immerse yourself, and come out, and you're ritually clean. And the jars are made of stone. Why? They're not made of clay. Why are they made of stone? For they're better able to maintain their purity. They're better able to maintain their purity. In reading and talking with I sometimes talk out loud with the people that I consult on scripture preparation in the morning for Sunday, and sometimes I yell at them, and occasionally they yell back at me, and I'll be okay as soon as my medication kicks in. But there is some confusion about, not confusion, there is a diversity of opinion about the nature of what's happening here. There's a nature of what's happening here. These jars are meant to symbolize the Hebraic faith. They're meant to symbolize something that exists. It's pre-existent, I believe. And so there is an inclination to go that, well, now we're just doing something radically different. And in ways we are. We're doing something radically different when we turn to Jesus Christ as a Messiah, as the representational human incarnate person of God on earth. We are looking in a different direction from what the persons who would have built those stone jars, from that direction, that they would have looked. Yes, we are. We're looking in a different direction. But I don't think we're meant to be necessarily hypercritical of anyone at this point. I think we're meant to look at this particular period of time in the sense that here is a most wonderful gift that is being demonstrated to us. This is a most wonderful gift that is being demonstrated to us. In John's Gospel, these events, these miraculous events are not called miracles, they are called signs. And these are to point us towards something. We are meant to look towards something. What does the sign point us toward? What is it that we are meant to understand here? 30 gallons, all by itself, 30 gallons of wine is a lot of wine. But there were many jars there, and they were all presumably filled with wine. So all we can say about this wine, one of the things that we can say about this wine, I'm I'm sure you can think of other things to say about the wine. But one of the things we can say about the wine is that this is copious. This is a phenomenal amount of wine. It's an extraordinary amount of wine. It is an unconceivable amount of wine. 60 gallons of wine? 90 gallons of wine? That's a lot of wine. Almost as much wine as is in our senior warden's wine cellar. I will pay for that. We have something happening here which is extraordinary. We have something happening here which is extraordinary. And that is, we have an incarnate God. That is the beginning of the story of the Gospel of John. What we have is in Jesus Christ the reality that, as John understands it, that God has become incarnate, living and breathing, with blood flowing in his veins, with dust that collects upon his feet when he walks upon the earth that all the others walk upon, all of us walk upon. We have an incarnate God on earth. And the point of the exercise, as we understand it now, in this wedding feast, with this wine, there are intimations of the Eucharist in this wine, the Last Supper in this wine. There are also intimations of the blood that will be spilled in the future. There are intimations of all of these things in this story. But what's important for me is that the human beings surrounding this wonderful event, this incredible, extraordinary human being, the individuals around this human being were given a living and breathing guide. A living and breathing guide on how to live out life. You know, how many times in our world, we all learn in different ways, but we all have a set of understandings about the cosmos, but isn't it easier sometimes if somebody will just show us? Isn't it easier if you just, you know, I think I can do that cross-stitch thing if you just show me. I think I can do that. I may not be able to do it as well as Eunice. But Eunice can show me, and then I will have that gift inside me. I've told you before that one of the great teachers in my life is Edwin Davis, the man who invented the tobacco harvester. Edwin Davis taught me to weld. By taking his hand. First of all, he showed me, arcing it and striking the arc. And then he put his hand upon my hand and showed me. And I was able, after that, to weld. Not as well as Edwin Davis could weld, but well enough to put clips on a tobacco harvester. This story is wonderful in its largesse. I believe that we are meant to see in this water to wine the great, infinite number of possibilities within the realm of God. The grace and largesse of God. I think we are meant to see the extraordinarily immense, if I can even use, I'm running out of words here, abundance of what it is like to live in the realm of God. The realm of God, the infinite possibilities. The incarnate God. Interestingly enough, only the disciples are mentioned as believing, as observing this and believing this. But what I trust that they realized was that they were in the company of an individual who could teach them by showing them how to live out their lives. And think now about this wonderful stone earth we live on. Think now about how full it is of new wine, of the people who have been touched by the persons who have been touched, by the persons who have been touched, by the persons who knew Jesus Christ as the incarnate God. And think about how different the world is because of that. Are we there? No. But the possibilities are infinite. And here's the piece. We have been given the challenge now, having been touched by the disciples that touched the disciples that touched the disciples. We have been given the challenge of being the disciples and touching others. We have been given the challenge of being the incarnate, or representing in our lives, the incarnate, the living, the breathing, the walking, the talking God on earth. This is how we do it. This is how we do it. We put out our hand. We show. We be those things which God would have